Hey everyone, this is a piece by a Joshua Muravchik. The piece is titled Theories of the New Class. It appears to be, at least this PDF is 43 pages long, so I'm probably going to turn this into a two-parter, just because it makes it easier to listen to later. So, here we are. All right. The importance of the idea of class to modern social science is part of the legacy of Karl Marx. Quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society," end quote, said Marx, quote, "is the history of class struggle," end quote. Manifesto of the Communist Party. The modern era was defined by the fact that history's last class struggle, quote, "the final conflict," end quote, was underway, the struggle between capitalists and proletarians. In this era, class divisions were becoming simpler than ever before. The number of classes was becoming smaller. Marx recognized that there were people whose occupations made them neither capitalists nor proletarians, rentiers, petty bourgeois, lumpen proletarians, but Marx believed that the dynamics of capitalism were rapidly compressing society, forcing all but an insignificant remnant of these other elements into one or the other of the two great classes. The first challenge to this formulation within the Marxist camp came from the German socialist leader Edward Bernstein, who in 1899 wrote that, quote, "the absorption of ... the middle classes by the extremes above and below them ... is no nearer in England, France, and Germany today than at any earlier time in the 19th century," end quote. Bernstein, Evolutionary Socialism. For this and other heresies, Bernstein was branded, quote, "revisionist," and was read out of the family of Marxist orthodoxy. Today, Marx's two-class formula is defended almost nowhere, is not even upheld by the official upholders of the faith. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia sets forth a revisionist position without admitting it, explaining that, quote, "Marxism-Leninism distinguishes between basic and non-basic classes, and also notes the presence of various groups and strata within classes and the interstitial strata between classes," end quote. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia, 3rd edition, volume 12, English translation, 1976. Whatever validity Marx's view may have held at the time it was formulated, it clearly will not do today. The first place its inadequacies became blatant was the Soviet Union. There the bourgeoisie was totally eliminated, yet manifestly Soviet society did not consist all of one class. Anti-Soviet writers pointed to the rise of a new ruling class, while the official Soviet position, although of course denying this accusation, was that the class struggle continued within the USSR. Even after it became clear to almost everyone that the structure of communist societies defied the Marxian class schema, the schema still seemed to retain some cogency as a model of the capitalist societies of the West. In the United States, the most important and least class-driven of the capitalist societies, the political process seemed fairly well described by a two-class model. The great divide in American politics during most of the 20th century was between a labor-based Democratic Party, whose program was to improve the lot of the masses through the expansion of the public sector, and on the other side, a business-based Republican Party, whose program was to protect the vitality of the, quote, "free enterprise system," end quote, from encroachment by the public sector. True, the workers were not socialists. True, the middle class was numerous. Nonetheless, the conflict between labor and business could plausibly be described as the basic axis of American politics, at least until the 1960s. This is a view by no means restricted to Marxists. The idea that classes exist in American society and that business and labor are the two most important, most cohesive, or at least most clearly identifiable, has been widely accepted both in social science and in everyday conversation and journalism. The validity of this dichotomy was challenged in the 1960s by the emergence of new political movements. The first was the New Left, which claimed to speak for a whole generation of college youth. Then came the somewhat less extravagant, quote, New Politics, or, quote, New Liberalism, which rallied the support of a large number of the college-educated of all ages, and which captured the Democratic presidential nomination in 1972. One of the striking things about these new kindred movements was that they obviously represented and appealed to neither business nor labor. Indeed, these movements were assertively hostile to both, and their adherents were mostly neither proletarians nor capitalists. Rather, they were social workers, teachers, writers, all manner of, quote, symbol specialists, end quote. Their activities inspired a variety of different commentators to ask whether a new class is emerging. Mankind has had symbol specialists for millennia. The question of whether these now constituted a class was stimulated by the fact that they had generated their own political movement. Marx referred to the proletariat as a class, but in the Communist Manifesto, Marx said, quote, the immediate aim of the communists is the ... formation of the proletariat into a class, end quote. This implies that a group becomes a class, not merely by sharing a common relation to the mode of production, but by developing a common political self-consciousness. In this sense, the rise of the New Left/New Politics inspired the view that the educated professionals were becoming a class. But the question was, and is, clouded by the absence of any accepted definition of class. Marx himself began the last chapter of Volume 3 of Capital with the statement, quote, the first question to be answered is this, what constitutes a class, end quote. And then the manuscript breaks off. Elsewhere in the corpus of his works, Marx gives some brief definitions, but these raise as many questions as they answer. None gives the definitive explanation that must have been intended for the uncompleted chapter of Capital. The absence of an accepted definition of class imposes on those who discuss the possible appearance of a new class the burden of first defining what they mean by the term, or at least so it would seem. Yet few, if any, of those who have written about the, quote, new class, end quote, have done so. Few have even displayed concern about this problem. Two exceptions are Jean Kirkpatrick and Daniel Bell. In her essay, Politics in the New Class, Jean Kirkpatrick stipulates a definition of the new class in a way that sets aside the question of defining class. Footnote. See the edited volume by Barry Bruce Briggs, The New Class, published in 1979, and footnote. In Jean Kirkpatrick's book, The New Presidential Elite, Jean Kirkpatrick consciously avoids the issue by emphasizing that here is an analysis of elites and of what she calls a, quote, new breed rather than of classes. Daniel Bell, in his essay, The New Class, A Muddled Concept, takes to task other writers for failing to define class. Yet in his book, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, a work that contributed mightily to interest in the new class, Bell speculated at length about the new class without stopping to define class. The closest Bell came was to observe that, quote, class in the final sense denotes not a specific group of persons, but a system that has institutionalized the ground rules for acquiring, holding, and transferring differential power and its attendant privileges, end quote. Daniel Bell. There are problems with this definition, not the least that its meaning is unclear. This general failure to define class is suggestive of a deeper problem. The political behavior that has caught the interest of those who have written about the new class seems clearly to be expressive neither of the proletariat nor of the capitalists. A few dogmatists have argued that the new left/new politics is, quote, objectively proletarian or, quote, objectively capitalist, but such arguments are tortured. They attempt to drive square pegs of reality into round holes of ideology. If this behavior is expressive of neither of the old classes, then perhaps it is expressive of a new class. But those who have written about the new class are unable to agree on what defines a class or who it comprises. Indeed, there are 4 or 5 different notions of who makes up the new class. This would be unimportant if it were merely a difference about where the boundaries of the class lie, but among them these writers have 4 or 5 different mutually exclusive groups in mind when they use the term, quote, new class. The possible existence of 4 or 5 new classes is enough to make some readers skeptical of the existence of any new class at all. To put it another way, it raises the question of whether the behavior in question is best understood as the behavior of a class. To put it another way, it raises the question of whether the behavior in question is best understood as the behavior of a class. This raises more general questions about the limits to which class analysis helps in understanding political phenomena. This paper surveys 21 writers who have contributed to the discussion of the new class. It groups them into 5 categories according to similarities in their conception of the new class. The first category consists of writers whose focus has been on communist countries and who have written about the rise of a new ruling class. The first category consists of writers whose focus has been on communist countries and who have written about the rise of a new ruling class. That's what I'm interested in here. The second category are writers sympathetic to the New Left who believe that it heralds the emergence of a new revolutionary class. The idea of the emergence of a new revolutionary class has evoked 3 kinds of responses that constitute the final 3 categories. There are those who agree that a new revolutionary class has emerged, but who are not sympathetic to it. They see it as a class defined by its dependence on the public sector. And see its political posture as nothing more than the selfish determination to expand the public sector. Then there are those who see the new class as nothing more than the traditional alienation of the intellectuals having now reached mass proportions. This group is less concerned than the others with exposition on the question of whether the new class is truly a class. Finally, there are those who deny or doubt that the new left/new politics phenomenon is best understood in class terms at all. But see it as something different. Within each category, the views of each writer will be summarized. Then some questions that unite or divide the writers in that category will be noted. The paper will conclude by formulating a few central questions that run through the various writings by the different authors. New section. The new ruling class. Nomad, Shactman, Burnham, Djilas, Laswell. Theories about the rise of a new class began with efforts to analyze Soviet society. By the 1930s, it was clear to all manner of leftists, other than the slavishly obedient affiliates of the Comintern, that Soviet society was something other than an example of the kind of worker self-rule that was the motivating vision of left radicalism. Unwilling to break the bonds of Marxian categories, some critics concluded that the USSR must still have some form of capitalist system. Others, notably Trotsky, maintained that the USSR was still a, quote, worker state, albeit with a bureaucratic excrescence overlaying and deforming it. But the more satisfying and eventually more influential analyses were those that held that a new class had arisen in Soviet society. First section. Max Nomad. Among the first to propound this view was Max Nomad, whose essay Masters Old and New was published in the 1930s. One second. Sorry. I had to get to the end notes again. Footnote, reprinted in V.F. Calverton's edited volume, The Making of Society. One second. End footnote. In it, Nomad described, quote, a vast crowd of educated and semi-educated people, all of them, quote, propertyless, end quote, who may or may not have a college degree, but can make a livelihood without resorting to manual or lower clerical labor, end quote. Max Nomad. Max Nomad noted that this group had been given various different labels. Max Nomad expressed indifference about which label was used. Max Nomad's concern was to make 2 points. First, this group should be seen as a class in itself, not merely as a subdivision of one of the traditional classes, not, for example, as, quote, intellectual workers. Second, it was this class that had come to power in Russia, giving the USSR its special social system. Nomad wrote, quote, the first case in history when this group came into its own was the Bolshevik Revolution and the establishment of the so-called Soviet system. That system has evolved an enormous hierarchy of intellectuals who are bureaucrats at the same time, administrative office holders, technical managers and engineers, judges, savants, journalists, writers, professors, higher transport and postal employees, Marx theologians, army officers, actors, singers, scientific spies, bank accountants, trade union and sports organizers, all of them government employees who owe their bourgeois comfort to the labor of the uneducated workers and peasants. Having eliminated the old parasitic strata of feudal lords and capitalist proprietors, these office holders have become the only consumers of privileged incomes. The badge of admission to this new privileged class is a certain amount of education or training exceeding the average level of the manual workers. End quote. Max Nomad. Not only does this class enjoy privilege, but, quote, being identical with the government, it has become the collective owner of the country's socialized economy, end quote. Max Nomad. Nomad's views built on those of an obscure Polish socialist, Václav Mahajski, some of whose writings Nomad translated. Mahajski had split from the Marxist movement after having come to the view that, quote, Marx's analysis of the bourgeois system lays bare only the antagonism between the capitalists and the workers, and altogether disregards the antagonism between the proletariat and bourgeois society, end quote. Mahajski. Footnote. See Mahajski's On the Expropriation of the Capitalists, published, I believe, in that, it says Ibid, so I believe it's also in that V.F. Calverton book, The Making of Society. Sorry, I know this is annoying. Sorry, I just had to type something down. Mahajski used, quote, bourgeois society to mean all of the educated as well as property owners. The intellectuals, warned Mahajski, would use, quote, socialist rhetoric as a lure for the manual workers, but were really out to secure their own privilege. Footnote. Mahajski's solution was for the workers to concentrate on purely economic demands. In this view, Mahajski, although Mahajski stood at the far left of the radical movements, advocating, quote, worldwide workers' conspiracies, end quote, and general strikes, echoed the views being expressed at about the same time by another ex-Marxist, this one regarded as the most right-wing figure of the workers' movement, Samuel Gompers. Gompers was bitterly hostile to the socialists, who Gompers thought were trying to use the working class for their own purposes, quote, unscrupulous socialist vote hunters, end quote, Samuel Gompers called them. I didn't know Gompers had anything to do with Marxism or socialism at any point. Gompers concluded that the labor movement could avoid being manipulated if it concentrated on direct economic action, strikes and collective bargaining, rather than on political activity, a legacy which has contributed to the unique character of American labor. End footnote. New section. Max Shactman. Max Shactman had been among the founders of the Communist Party in the United States and then of the Trotskyist movement. In 1940, Shactman broke with Trotsky and established a rival party. The issue over which they split was Shactman's theory that the bureaucracy ruling the Soviet Union had become a new class, and that the Soviet system was not, quote, communism, as Shactman, Trotsky, Lenin, and Marx had used that term, but was a new social form which Shactman called, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. This new ruling class, quote, is unique in that it does not own the national property which it rules, but does, quote, own the state. It derives its vast economic power and privilege exclusively from the political power it exercises through its chosen instrument, the Communist Party, end quote, wrote Shactman. Footnote. See Shactman, The Bureaucratic Revolution, published 1962. So that would have been Shactman after 20 years of first criticizing the notion of the USSR being a worker state. What made Shactman's views unpalatable to Trotsky and other leftists was this assertion that the rule of the new class rested on its political power and that the new class's economic power was merely derivative. Marxists were accustomed to thinking that one of the key tenets of their creed was that economic relations are the fundamental relations, and the political relations flow therefrom. Against this traditional outlook, Shactman adduced Marx himself, quote, the proletariat will use the proletariat's political supremacy, end quote, quoted Shactman from the Communist Manifesto, quote, to wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie, end quote. Shactman. Note, said Shactman, that the proletariat's economic power follows and derives from political power. So too with the new class, Shactman said. Shactman argued that his view was not a departure from Marxism. Political forces were not, in his view, more powerful, per se, than economic forces. On the contrary, where the power of property was still exercised directly, that is, where it was privately owned, the power of property remained the preeminent source of power. Shactman held that the Nazi bureaucracy was not unlike the communist bureaucracy, and that the Nazi bureaucracy had been drawn from similar social roots. But, Shactman said, the Nazi bureaucracy had not become a class because the Nazi bureaucracy had not gained control of the economy, which remained instead in the hands of private capital. The communist bureaucracy, in contrast, had used its political power to achieve economic power as well, and combining both in its own hands, had made itself into a class. Where economic power has been put in the hands of the state, their political power becomes decisive. From this it followed that in speaking of the, quote, bureaucracy, Shactman meant not so much the managers and administrators as the political officials. Within the bureaucracy, he said, it is, quote, in particular the party bureaucracy, which is decisive, end quote. Shactman. New section, Milovan Djilas. And I have a piece by the author who wrote this piece that I'm reading now, on the intellectual development of Milovan Djilas. I think it's called The Intellectual Odyssey of Milovan Djilas. It's very informative. The most famous version of the theory of the new ruling class under communism was that presented by Milovan Djilas in his book, The New Class. Like Shactman, Djilas identified the new class as the bureaucracy, and like Shactman, Djilas emphasized the political basis of the power of the new class and the use of that power to gain economic power. Quote, it is the bureaucracy which formally uses, administers, and controls both nationalized and socialized property, as well as the entire life of society, end quote, Djilas said. And who is the, quote, bureaucracy? The bureaucracy is, said Djilas, quote, only a special stratum of bureaucrats, those who are not administrative officials, bracket who, and bracket make up the core, ... of the new class. This is actually a party or political bureaucracy, end quote. Djilas. This too is similar to Shactman's view. There was only a slight nuance of difference. Shactman remained a Leninist and as such was more reluctant than Djilas to believe ill of the party as a whole. I'm going to say maybe a Leninist party in the abstract, but certainly Shactman did not hesitate to believe extremely ill of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. Just a side note for myself. And it also should be noted that this article is kind of unprofessional. I can't believe it was actually published because he spells Shactman's name like different every other line. However, there's some good information here. So it's good to see how much you can fuck up the technical aspects of a paper and it still get published. Shactman remained a Leninist and as such was more reluctant than Djilas to believe ill of the party as a whole. The party bureaucracy which grew into the new class was, in Shactman's view, a malign growth within what had been a healthy organism. Why this malignity had developed was a difficult question to answer. To Djilas, no longer a Leninist, the explanation was simpler. The new class grew out of the party itself, not some inexplicable growth within the party. Quote, the bureaucracy is nothing else but the party which carried out the revolution, end quote. Djilas said, quote, the communist revolution is the first to be carried out to the advantage of the revolutionaries, end quote, not on behalf of some larger class or interest. The views of Shactman, especially Djilas, echo predictions made almost a century earlier by the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who was condemned by Marx. Shactman and Djilas, who were both Marxists at the time of these writings, would have resented the comparison. Since Bakunin's time, anarchists have competed, not too successfully, with Marxists for leadership of the revolutionary left. The anarchist argument against the Marxists is that if revolutionaries take over the government, the revolutionaries will just become a new government, and oppression will continue. As Bakunin put it, quote, the so-called people state will be nothing other than the quite despotic administration of the masses of people by a new and very non-numerous aristocracy of real and supposed learned ones, end quote. Bakunin. Footnote. Although he has not published further on this particular subject, Djilas almost surely no longer holds to the analysis presented in the new class. The new class was a Marxian analysis of communism. The new class attacked communism for betraying Marxist ideals. But a few years later, Djilas rethought this question. Djilas ended by rejecting Marxism and concluding that communism may have been an inevitable outcome of Marxism. This view was set forth in his book, The Unperfect Society, published in 1969. End footnote. Shactman and Djilas might deny it, but it is hard not to see the similarity between this prediction by Bakunin and Shactman and Djilas' descriptions of communist reality. New section. James Burnham. When Shactman split from Trotsky, one of his fellow apostates was James Burnham. Burnham agreed that a new class had arisen in the USSR, but Burnham disagreed with Shactman about that class's composition. To Burnham, the new class consisted of managers, a view Burnham presented in his book, The Managerial Revolution. Burnham's view was a more conventionally Marxian one than Shactman's or Djilas's. Burnham did not believe that classes could be based on political power. To him, economic power remains supreme. Quote, it is the relation to the instruments of production which decides the issue of class dominance, of power and privilege in society, end quote, Djilas said. Footnote. Burnham's intellectual journey did not halt with his split from Trotsky. On the contrary, Burnham's intellectual journey gathered momentum and carried Burnham to the conservative side of the political spectrum. It is unlikely that in Burnham's later years, Burnham still held to the Marxian analysis set forth in The Managerial Revolution. End footnote. The new class perceived by Burnham was not composed of political bureaucrats, but of industrial managers, those who controlled the instruments of production. It was the fact of day-to-day control of industry by the managers, and not the abstraction of, quote, public ownership, end quote, that really mattered. Quote, the instruments of production are the seat of social domination, end quote, Burnham said. Quote, who controls the instruments of production, in fact, not in name, controls society, end quote. Burnham, Managerial Revolution. It was this control that made the managers a new ruling class. Because the new class, as Burnham saw it, was not defined by its political role, Burnham believed that it was not unique to communism. On the contrary, Burnham spoke of the worldwide revolution in which all countries, or at least all industrialized countries, would be transformed into, quote, managerial societies within a matter of decades. Under communism, the managers ran nationalized industry. In the capitalist countries, a different process occurred, but with similar results. Industry here was still privately owned, but, and this was crucial, the private owners no longer ran the businesses. The private owners merely clipped coupons. The businesses were run by managers, the same elite who ran the nationalized industries of Russia. In this sense, the difference between the two situations was inconsequential. In fact, the class of private owners would soon disappear altogether because it no longer served any function. New section. Harold Lasswell. One second. Harold Lasswell, in his book World Revolutionary Elites, endorsed Burnham's formulation that the rise of a new class constituted, quote, the world revolution of the epoch, end quote. Footnote. See H.D. Lasswell's article, The World Revolution of Our Time, a Framework for Basic Policy Research, published in H.D. Lasswell and Daniel Lerner's edited volume, World Revolutionary Elites. End footnote. Lasswell agreed with Burnham that the rise of the new class was occurring all over the world, but Lasswell was closer to Nomad in his identification of that class. In Lasswell's view, it was intellectuals, non-industrial managers, who made up the new class. Like Nomad, Lasswell cited Václav Mahaisky as a source for his interpretation. The difference between communist countries and Western countries was that in Western countries, quote, the paths to power, wealth, respect, and other values were sufficiently open to intellectuals to render it unnecessary to rely upon affiliation with a revolutionary party to advance their fortunes, end quote. Lasswell. In contrast, in Russia, quote, significant components of the intellectual classes, frustrated by lack of opportunity, turn to revolutionary violence, end quote. Harold Lasswell. On the whole, Lasswell's ideas about the new class are less clearly formed than those of Nomad, Shactman, Djilas, or Burnham. All of the latter seem to have something specific in mind when they use the word, quote, class, even though none of them defines the word class. But Lasswell seems to slide back and forth between the concepts, quote, elite and, quote, class, effortlessly, suggesting that the term, quote, class has no particular meaning for Harold Lasswell. Harold Lasswell's theories fit less neatly into the category of those who saw the new class as a new ruling class under communism than do the theories of the other four. Nonetheless, Harold Lasswell was obviously interested in some of the same phenomena that interested these other authors. In comparing these five writers, two issues stand out. One is that there are at least three different conceptions about who constitutes the new class. To Nomad and Lasswell is a class of, quote, intellectuals, end quote. To Djilas and Shactman, it is one of, quote, bureaucrats. To Burnham, it is, quote, managers. Correspondingly, there are different conceptions of the source of power of the class. The power of the intellectuals derives from the intellectuals' ability to shape the culture and thereby to manipulate other classes. That of the bureaucrats derives from the bureaucrats' organizational skills and the bureaucrats' possession of offices. That of the managers derives from the managers' control over industry. The second issue is whether the new class that has emerged under communism can also appear under capitalism. Burnham and Laswell both state that this new class, Burnham and Laswell both state that they are discussing a worldwide phenomenon. To Shactman, quote, "This contention is an absurdity," end quote. In Shactman's view, the very definition of the new class derives from the unique role in Soviet society of the Communist Party. Obviously, a similar class cannot exist under capitalism. Djilas avoids this question by disclaiming any knowledge of the West, but it would be hard for Djilas to reach a conclusion much different from Shactman's, given that Djilas' view of the nature of the new class is so similar to Shactman's. Nomad is less explicit on this question than any of the others save Djilas, but it seems clear that Soviet Russia provides just one extreme example of what he sees as the universal striving of the intellectuals for mastery over the manual worker. Second. New section. The new revolutionary class. Mills, Galbraith, Bazelon, Harrington. And this is going to be less important for my own particular interests, but it still will be interesting, I'm sure. The rise of the New Left in the United States in the 1960s inspired speculation about the rise of a new class. American society was being shaken, as rarely before, by radical political movements, and these movements, whatever else one might say about these movements, were manifestly not rooted in the industrial proletariat. On the left, some voices hailed the appearance of a new revolutionary class. Given the tradition of the left, this was a difficult idea. Radicalism among the middle classes was hardly a new phenomenon. Marx and Engels devoted more than 1/4 of the total length of the Communist Manifesto to a scathing critique of various forms of, quote, bourgeois socialism and, quote, petty bourgeois socialism. Since then, the term, quote, middle-class radical, end quote, has been used on the left as one of opprobrium. The essence of Marxism was to tie socialism to the proletariat. By tying socialism to the proletariat, Marx believed that he had made socialism, quote, scientific. But what Marx had really done was to give socialism a new moral power by making socialism the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy that, quote, the meek shall inherit the earth, end quote, an idea that resonates to the depths of Western culture. A distinctly different and less gripping image is formed by imagining that the earth shall be inherited instead by the teachers, psychologists, journalists, students at elite universities, and similar types who make up the new class. The two writers on the left who dared to defy tradition and to welcome the appearance of a new revolutionary class were David T. Bazelon and Michael Harrington. Two others, C. Wright Mills and John Kenneth Galbraith, contributed some ideas to this area of speculation. New section. John Kenneth Galbraith. Galbraith may have been the first to write about a new class existing in the United States. In his book, The Affluent Society, published in 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith spoke of a, quote, new class, and defined this new class as comprising those people, quote, whose primary identification is with their job rather than the income the job returns, end quote. Galbraith. John Kenneth Galbraith. By this, John Kenneth Galbraith meant all those who define their work not as a means of producing income, but as a source of pleasure, prestige, and self-expression. Although this definition raises some problems, for example, mightn't it include large numbers of businessmen who by definition cannot be part of a new class unless we go back and redefine the old classes? It remains one of the most creative that has been devised, and it is simpler and less vague than some others. In the book The Affluent Society, John Kenneth Galbraith did not, however, assign any political role to the new class. It was not until John Kenneth Galbraith's next book, The New Industrial State, that John Kenneth Galbraith spoke of the new class's political potential. In this book, Galbraith no longer spoke of a simple new class, but rather of two new classes, the, quote, technostructure and the, quote, educational and scientific estate, end quote. And John Kenneth Galbraith saw the technostructure and the educational and scientific estate as being prone to conflict with each other. The technostructure, those who, quote, bring specialized knowledge, talent, or experience to group decision-making, end quote, in the modern corporation, was described by Galbraith as politically timid, clustering about the skirts of the corporate system that gave it birth. But the educational and scientific state might possibly, quote, become a decisive instrument of political power, end quote. John Kenneth Galbraith. John Kenneth Galbraith attributed the liberal stance of the Democratic Party in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California to the political ascent of the educational and scientific estate. The program of reform advocated by Galbraith gave heavy emphasis to foreign policy. John Kenneth Galbraith placed special importance on ending the arms race by replacing a policy of conflict with a policy of, quote, patience in our relations with the USSR. Domestically, John Kenneth Galbraith sought a program of cultural reform in which American society would come to substitute aesthetic goals for economic goals. Neither the existing corporate world nor the trade unions, said John Kenneth Galbraith, would be likely to have much interest in such a program of reform. If this program was to be adopted, it could only be through the political initiative of the educational and scientific estate. New section. C. Wright Mills. Mills presented no theory of the new class, but earlier than Galbraith or Harrington, Mills noted the political potential of this group. In 1960, Mills wrote, quote, I have been studying for several years now the intellectuals as a possible immediate radical agency of change, end quote. C. Wright Mills. In the article The New Left, published in I.L. Horowitz's edited volume Power, Politics, and People, published in 1963. End footnote. Other than their earliness, Mills' observations were noteworthy in one way. Mills saw the rise of the new class as worldwide. Quote, who is it that is thinking and acting in radical ways, end quote, Mills asked rhetorically. Then Mills answered, quote, all over the world, in the block, outside the block, and in between. The answer's the same. It's the young intelligentsia, end quote. Mills. To Mills, the new class, not Mills' term, exists in communist countries as well as in capitalist countries. But Mills' views contrast sharply with those of other theorists of the new class under communism. Whereas, for example, Max Nomad saw intellectuals as the rulers under communism, Mills saw them as the dissidents. Mills left unanswered the questions raised by his view that the radicalism of the intelligentsia is worldwide. Namely, if the phenomenon is worldwide, then can it possibly be attributable to any structural change in society? If so, what structural change has occurred in common everywhere in the world? If not, what can be the cause of this phenomenon? New section. David T. Bazelon. David Bazelon was the first to present a more or less full-blown theory of the rise of the new class in the United States. In Bazelon's book, Power in America, The Rise of the New Class, published in 1963, Bazelon wrote that Marx went wrong, quote, in the identification of the historically active class. It turned out, that it was not the so-called working class that would make the revolution for itself. It was the new class that would lead anyone who might follow to make a revolution for itself, end quote. Bazelon. Footnote. See David T. Bazelon's book, Power in America, The Rise of the New Class. End footnote. If the new class will make the revolution for itself, that is, in its own interest, what is the new class's interest? The answer, says Bazelon, is planning. One way to describe the new class is that the new class is composed of planners, not, quote, planners in a formal sense, but, more generally, planners in the sense that, quote, planning is inherent in the educated person's activity, conceptualizing and thinking ahead, end quote. Bazelon. Because they have been trained to plan, educated people must be allowed to plan society. Quote, it is a serious maladjustment of power in America which keeps this planning from going forward and consequently frustrates the members of the new class, end quote, says Bazelon. American society must allow this frustration to be relieved. Quote, their deeper sense of community must begin, ... with the triumph of planning, ... They must have their due. We have invited it, now we must satisfy it, end quote, Bazelon says. If we don't permit the new class to express the new class's self by planning society, Bazelon warns, there will be a violent, quote, convulsive reaction, end quote. Bazelon. Who makes up the new class? It is the, quote, educated masses, end quote, says Bazelon. Quote, you are probably a member of the new class if you buy or read books, end quote. Bazelon. What is distinctive about the book readers that makes the book readers a class and gives the book readers such an important political destiny? It is that this class consists of non-economic man. It is, quote, a new class that has been freed from the old conception of American money, the infinite perspective of unending accumulation, end quote. Bazelon. The new class, however, is not powerful enough to make the new class's revolution unassisted. How, then, will the new class triumph? With the aid of the underclass. Bazelon says, quote, the decisive relation for the future will be that of the new class and the underclass, end quote. Bazelon. This relation will take two forms. First, there will be a coalition in Congress between representatives elected by the new class and those elected by the underclass. This will give the alliance political punch. Second, the new class and the underclass meet in the public agencies that are staffed by members of the former and serve members of the latter. This will give the alliance the power of cultural innovation because new, quote, qualities of life, bracket, will, end bracket, emerge from the administration of the underclass by the new class, end quote. Bazelon. This alliance will also serve the crucial functioning of, quote, humanizing, end quote, the members of the new class. Even without the alliance, the new class will eventually triumph. But if it triumphs unhumanized by the underclass, it will institute an authoritarian society on the model of the Soviet Union. With the alliance, the triumph of the new class can bring about important change for the better. Of the new class, with the alliance, the triumph of the new class can bring about important change for the better. Of what would this change consist? Of two things, enlarging the government and reducing materialism. We need the government because, quote, fewer areas of social life can safely remain free of governing, end quote. Bazelon. We need reduced materialism because, quote, the technological order, end quote, is threatening to destroy us spiritually. To save ourselves, quote, a majority of us must decide to be friends instead of pigs, and this majority must rule, end quote. Bazelon. New section, Michael Harrington. And if you didn't know, Michael Harrington was the starter of the Democratic Socialists of America. He also kind of emerges out of a third camp Trotskyism, and he was part of the section of it which moved towards social democracy, as opposed to people like Hal Draper, Julius Jacobson, who were like the left Shactmanists, if that makes sense, Shactmanites. I don't think Michael Harrington had all the I'm not sure. I'm speculating here because I'm not an expert on Michael Harrington, but I believe that Michael Harrington did not follow Shactman to his hawkish foreign policy views. Anyway, Shactman's hawkish foreign policy views. Anyway, after Bazelon, and probably stimulated by Bazelon, the second writer to welcome the American New Class, for the American New Class's revolutionary potential, was the socialist activist Michael Harrington. In 1968, Harrington hailed the emergence of the new class in Harrington's book, Toward a Democratic Left. A decade later, Harrington returned to the subject, defending the new class against some of its neoconservative critics in an essay entitled The New Class and the Left. In 1968, Harrington viewed the new class as, quote, an unprecedented class, end quote. A, quote, conscience constituency, end quote. Michael Harrington said that, quote, a new social stratum is being formed by modern technology, which could well have a non-material interest in basic change, end quote. Michael Harrington. By, quote, interest, Harrington, a Marxist, means, quote, to have a stake in, end quote, not, quote, to be interested by, end quote. Thus, a, quote, non-material interest, end quote, is itself a rather odd idea. And Harrington agrees that such a class would consist of, quote, politically and socially unprecedented types of human beings, end quote. Michael Harrington. What then would be the content of this interest? It would be conscience. Quote, it is possible, end quote, said Harrington, quote, that conscience is acquiring an economic and social and therefore political weight in the society that it never had before, end quote. Michael Harrington. The members of this class have higher education, said Harrington. And Harrington pointed out that, quote, study after study documents a correlation between high educational attainment and libertarian views on civil liberties, capital punishment, open occupancy, and the war in Vietnam, end quote. Michael Harrington. Apparently, these, quote, libertarian views gave evidence of conscience. Parenthesis, Harrington did not explain what exactly was a, quote, libertarian view, end quote, of the war in Vietnam. Harrington cited three expressions of the emergence of the new class: the growth of unionism in the professions, the chorus of student demands for, quote, a role in determining curriculum, end quote, and the liberal insurgency in the Catholic Church inspired by the papacy of John the 23rd. The Pope died yesterday. Pope Francis died yesterday as I'm reading this. These examples had the effect of clouding Harrington's description of the new class. Of the three, the one which is most readily understandable as an expression of, quote, conscience is that of the Catholics. Yet it is less than obvious that liberal insurgency within the Catholic Church gives evidence of the existence of, quote, new or, quote, unprecedented types of people. It is possible to recall previous liberal insurgencies within the Church, including, for example, one which occurred as long as 4.5 centuries ago, and which was not without consequence. Unionism in the professions has occurred mostly among teachers. It is not clear what this has to do with conscience. The proposition, for example, that teachers join unions for reasons of conscience, while steelworkers join unions for reasons of self-interest, would probably sound strange to both members of the teachers' union and to those of the steelworkers' union. The proposition that student demands for a role in determining curriculum are an expression of, quote, conscience might possibly be endorsed by some students, but there are at least some other observers who have detected more mundane motives. In his later writing, Harrington took a somewhat amended view. The talk of a, quote, conscience constituency, end quote, had gone the way of the affluent 1960s. Quote, the 1970s were to demonstrate rather rudely, end quote, confessed Harrington, that, quote, this stratum has economic needs of its own, end quote. Harrington. No doubt sensitized by his own false start on this question, Harrington said in 1979 that the usefulness of the concept of the new class depended on, quote, carefully specifying the new class's members, end quote. Harrington. As a first step, Harrington set forth the proposition that, quote, there is an identifiable population new to the social structure and with common views that has already made a quantum leap in its impact on our political life in recent years and will continue to have an impact in the future, end quote. Michael Harrington. How do we identify this population? Harrington is ambivalent about whether education alone is this population's badge of membership. First, Harrington notes that there have been many different views of the new class and counts himself as one of three thinkers whose, quote, definition of the new class is, quote, the educated class in general, end quote. Harrington. Two paragraphs later, Harrington says that the expansion of higher education is, quote, a key index to the existence of this class, but not its definition, end quote. What Harrington seems to prefer for a, quote, definition is this description, quote, there is a new stratum/class in the American social structure. Its members are characterized by college or graduate or professional education and relatively well-paid occupations, often in a new technological sector, with some opportunity for non-routine work, end quote. Michael Harrington. Apparently, the references to being well-paid and to doing non-routine work, two criteria which have not been mentioned previously, are inferred from elite occupational status. Thus, in sum, the new class consists of college-educated holders of elite occupations who may or may not be employed in the knowledge sector. But the categories of elite occupations for which Harrington thanks Barry Bruce Briggs include, by design, all of the jobs that presuppose college. Thus, to categorize people as college-educated holders of elite occupations is by this definition hardly different from categorizing them merely as college-educated. Thus, after a long way around, Harrington is back to where Harrington started. The new class is the college-educated. Having established that, what else do we know about it? Quote, it is immediately obvious that this stratum is not a ruling class, end quote, says Harrington. To support this, Harrington adduces only income figures, apparently on the premise that wealth and rule are synonymous. Harrington reports that the top 5% of incomes in 1970 began at $24,250, and Harrington says, quote, most of the people we have been describing, bracket, as the new class, end bracket, are not even in the top 5%, end quote. Nowhere does Harrington estimate the size of the new class, but the proportion of American adults with college education is around 15%, and it is a reasonable inference that Harrington has intended the new class to be thought of as at least that large. If not, then why all the hoopla? Yet if the new class makes up 10% of the population or more, the fact that most of its members do not fall in the top 5% of incomes is not very remarkable. To all of the exhilarating promises that have over the years been made about the benefits of socialism, surely Harrington does not wish to add the goal of a society in which 15% of the population will receive incomes in the top 5%. To put further distance between Harrington's self and Harrington's earlier theory of the, quote, conscience constituency, end quote, Harrington emphasizes that the new class is not, quote, a community of idealistic angels devoid of any self-interest. Such a notion is silly, end quote. Michael Harrington. Further, although Michael Harrington wrote at one point that one of the reasons for believing that there is a new class is that it has, quote, common views, end quote, Harrington notes a few pages later that, quote, like every other class, bracket, it is, end bracket, internally ambiguous and even contradictory, end quote. Harrington. Thus the new class, quote, is not inevitably or inherently on the left or the right. The new class has tendencies towards both liberal elitism and a democratic politics of alliance with working people and the poor, end quote. Harrington. The economic discomfort suffered by the new class in the 1970s could help to bring out its best tendencies. These could, quote, turn the new class from planning for others, parenthesis, which is its elitist tendency, end parenthesis, to planning for themselves and others, end quote. Harrington. Such a shift would lead the new class to manifest the new class's, quote, social and democratic tendency, end quote. Harrington. One of the things that makes Harrington's argument a bit hard to follow is his use of the terms, quote, right, in the sense of right wing, and, quote, liberal elitism, end quote, liberal elitism interchangeably. Quote, liberal elitism is a tendency exemplified, Harrington says, by the willingness of Sidney and Beatrice Webb to apologize for Stalinism, and by implication, by the willingness of certain American liberals or radicals to do likewise today. To be on the, quote, right means to lend oneself to defending or, quote, shoring up bourgeois society. In Harrington's view, the political spectrum has two poles. On the left is socialism, as defined by Harrington. On the right is both communism and capitalism, and ideologies that apologize for either one. Correspondingly, the future holds only two alternatives. If the new class turns to planning for its own benefit, as well as that of others, then it will help to usher in a socialist system based on democracy and egalitarianism. If instead it persists in planning only for the benefit of others, then it will become the perhaps unwitting tool of a process in which the corporations will bring about a form of communism over which the new class will rule. Such a society would be a form of authoritarianism, quote, perhaps with a democratic facade, end quote. Michael Harrington. Interestingly, Harrington apparently regards the posing of this dichotomy as constituting an appeal to the new class to join Harrington in pursuit of socialism. What issues unite or divide those theorists who see the new class as a new revolutionary class? First, Mills saw the phenomenon as existing worldwide, including the communist countries and Third World. None of the others address this directly, but it is safe to surmise that none would agree with Mills in the light of their belief that the new class arises out of structural changes in the economy. Indeed, if Mills' observation is correct, then the theories of Harrington, Bazelon, and Galbraith are mortally wounded. Second, Bazelon says that the new class is characterized by the new class's habit of planning, and Harrington cites this approvingly. Galbraith, in contrast, believes that the attitude of the educational and scientific estate is shaped by a revulsion against planning, that is, against the manipulative planning of the big corporations, which takes, quote, precedence over the freely expressed will of the individual, end quote. Galbraith. Third, all of these observers seem to agree that the political role of the new class is ambiguous. The new class has a capacity for a bad as well as a good political role. Fourth, the most interesting difference between the two main proponents of the revolutionary new class, Bazelon and Harrington, is over the question of who will be its allies. To Bazelon, the natural ally is the underclass. The working class is explicitly rejected. To Harrington, the poor, i.e. the underclass, can be part of the ideal, quote, left coalition, but the principal partner of the new class must be the working class. To Bazelon, the new class will probably triumph on its own with their alliances. To Harrington, the new class can only triumph with alliances. If the new class makes itself a part of a, quote, left coalition, its triumph will mean the triumph of socialism. If instead it follows the path of liberal elitism, it will triumph in partnership with the corporations and bring about a form of communism over which it will rule. Okay, so I'm going to cut this essay in half here. This is going to be the end of the first part. The next part is going to be titled The Adversary Culture. Schumpeter, Podhoretz, Kirkpatrick, Lipset, Bell. Thanks for listening.